welcome. Thank you for coming back and joining me for Season 2, Episode 4 of this Active Health podcast. I'm Dr. Juliet McGrattan, author, speaker, former GP, and I'm on a little bit of a mission to help people find good health, happiness, well-being, simply through putting on a pair of running shoes. You can download this show on all your favourite podcast apps. If you want to listen to Season 1, you can find that as well. Just search Active Health in the search bar. Now, I'm very grateful, as usual, to Whisper Sports for hosting this podcast. Please give them a follow on social media at Whisper Sports, and you can find me at Dr. Juliet McGrattan. As you know, you can come and join me as I talk to both runners and health experts to dig deeply into the problems that women face when they're trying to stay active, from urethras to urticaria, from estrogen to osteoarthritis. We have no taboo topics. Now, today's show is going to be all about fueling our running and how do we make sure that we're putting enough energy into our body to supply it with all it needs for our active lives and for our running as well. Now, you might have heard of the term Relative Energy Deficiency in sports, RED-S. This is when our body literally doesn't have enough energy and we get overdrawn in the energy stakes. And this has significant consequences on our body. And this is such an important topic, and I really want to help everybody to understand it. And I wanted to address it because although you might think it doesn't apply to you, I think it can actually be quite easy to slip into energy deficiency. So I'm really delighted to have a true expert joining me today, Renee McGregor. And there's so much to say about Renee, but I do want to fill you in on some of it. She's a leading sports dietitian, and she specialises in RED-S, eating disorders, the female athlete, and athlete health and performance. She's hugely experienced. She's worked in the London 2012 Olympics, Rio 2016 Paralympics, Scottish gymnastics, Scottish ballet, women's Reading football, and the English National Ballet too. And she's an author of Training Food, Fast Fuel books and Orthorexia, When Healthy Eating Goes Bad. I also wanted to mention Train Brave campaign. You may have heard of that. It's a campaign to raise awareness of eating disorders in sport and provide resources and really practical strategies to help. And Renee is co-founder and director of Train Brave. So she's a speaker, a writer. She regularly contributes to radio and television. There's a lot more that I can say, but I'm just going to welcome her into the podcast. So hi, Renee.
Hi, Julia. It's nice to speak to you.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm really grateful that you've taken the invitation and that we can really learn from you. And thank you so much for sharing all your expertise.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And it's such a great podcast and such a great platform to raise awareness, particularly in this area. So yeah, a really good opportunity for me too. So thank you for having me.
No, you're very welcome. Thank you. Well, it's actually become a little bit of a habit over the last few podcasts for me just to start by asking you about your last run, because I didn't mention in your bio that on top of all of that, you're a keen runner as well. So tell me about your last run.
So actually, my last run was this morning, which was interesting because it was a recovery run because I'd done a harder run yesterday. I've actually got a goal at the moment. And I ran with a friend. And when we started, it was blue skies. It was quite sunny. And I was like, oh, I think I'm overdressed. And then literally 20 minutes in, it started to sleet and it was freezing and it was windy and we were going up a hill and I was like, yeah, I dressed appropriately. That's all good. So that was my last run. But it was nice. It's a nice, easy recovery run after yesterday's session.
The weather is, I have to say, crazy at the minute. I've been quite lucky. I've managed to get out in those little windows, but it is, like you say, sunny 1 minute and then the next minute it's hailing and you're sheltering under a tree. So yeah, it's a bit difficult to know what to wear at the moment.
It is absolutely bonkers. And then, the weekend we just had these storms and I was out for my run and there's like obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. And I was just like, I don't think I've ever had a run that I was like, oh, I've got to climb this tree. Oh, now I've got to jump over this fence. It was just like nonsense, like an obstacle course rather than a running. Just a normal run.
puddle dodging is what I've been doing a lot of recently. Trying to jump big strides over the puddles. Okay, well let's just dive straight into RED-S. I kind of explained it in the way that I understand it, but can you kind of define it for us? What actually is RED-S?
Yeah, sure. So RED-S is, basically it's when there's not enough energy in the system, so in the body, to support the work that the body's doing, and work being both training and movement, but also all biological function. And I think what often gets confused is this kind of term of like energy availability. So it's the energy that's left available once you have taken out the energy used for training and movement. And if that energy available is not sufficient to support biological processes, that's when we start to see this kind of downregulation in the body, and then you start to see some of the symptoms that are associated with RED-S. But I think the other key thing to say is that there's two types of RED-S, which is often missed. So there's accidental RED-S, where an individual falls into it completely by accident, in the sense they just don't appreciate how much energy they're utilizing and how much energy their body needs to live and to train. But then there is the much more sort of complicated intentional RED-S, where somebody is consciously making the decision to eat less and or train more, which has got a much more sort of psychological, it's definitely associated with disordered eating and eating disorder. So it's I guess RED-S, it's probably good to say RED-S is kind of on this continuum, because I think often I get asked the question, well, how does it differ from an eating disorder? It does, because it's not always intentional. It's not always associated with psychological changes, but it can be. So we do have to kind of make sure that people are aware of that.
That's a really interesting and really important point, isn't it? So really, as I said, it could affect any of us without us even really meaning to be.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think again, people often associate RED-S, because we've heard so much about it in sport. People often associate it with like elite level athletes, but actually one of the latest studies has shown we don't actually know the prevalence, but it's looking like that in recreational athletes, so people like yourself and myself, there's as high a chance as like 43% prevalence of RED-S in recreational athletes.
43%. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm really surprised by that. It's massive.
Yeah.
So what are the consequences? You mentioned it can have downregulation and consequences on the body. What actually starts to happen?
So, I mean, it basically, as I said, it tends to affect every single biological process. So if we go back to energy availability, if there's not enough energy available for biological processes, it will downregulate all these. So you might find that you get a depressed immune system, and that might feature as a higher prevalence of infections and illness. But equally, RED-S is diagnosed by exclusion, like a lot of medical conditions. And so you'd look at like a series of blood test results. So one of the things we'll see often in people who have RED-S is that their white cell count is low. So that's a real important thing. As a medic, it's really important to kind of be aware of that this low white cell count could be a big indicator that somebody's in RED-S. Other systems that get affected is like your digestive system. So again, people don't always appreciate that when you have RED-S, you can get gastroparesis and dysbiosis. So what I mean by that is gastroparesis is this very slow movement of food through the gut. And that's because there's not enough energy in the body to be able to do digestion properly. And the difficulty here is that often the symptoms are very similar to IBS. And so people will go and try and get some help, and they'll be told they've got IBS. And also the treatment at the moment for IBS is exclusion diet. So then you exclude your diet even further, and you make this situation a lot worse. So it's really important to kind of be able to sort of work out whether this is actually gastroparesis or IBS. And I think sometimes that can be quite tricky, but doing a good history can help you to ascertain that. And when I talk about dysbiosis, what I mean there is that the gut flora and the gut microbiome that we know is so important for our health and our mental health and our immune system becomes dysregulated, because again, there's not enough energy in the body to cultivate and allow for colonization of the good bacteria that we need in order to have a healthy gut. Then one of the other big symptoms we see is obviously a change in hormones. So in women, we'll see a decrease in estrogen and obviously also the controlling hormones, LH and FSH. And this decrease in estrogen means there's a higher risk of all sorts of different things like bone health. It can affect your cognitive function. It can affect your mood. And that's quite similar for males as well. So there'll be a down-regulation of production of testosterone, which again will affect bone health and will affect mood, because we know that both estrogen and testosterone are serotonin receptor uptake. They are both serotonin uptake receptors. And so they take in serotonin, which is a really important neurotransmitter for our well-being and our mood. So if you don't have enough estrogen and testosterone, it can start to affect your mood. So one of the symptoms we often see with people who have RED-S and low energy availability is this kind of very flat mood, quite a low mood, which they can't quite work out what it is, but it's often associated with this change in hormones. It can also affect your metabolism. So, if there's not enough energy in the system, the body will always prioritize movement, and then it will down-regulate your metabolism so that you basically preserve energy. So, one of the biggest questions I get asked is, if I haven't got enough energy in the system, how come I'm not losing weight? Well, the body will go into compensatory behaviors. So human bodies are biologically biased to be in a positive energy balance. So if you put somebody in a very negative energy balance, then compensatory behaviors start, which means that you get this preservation of energy in the body, so you actually don't lose weight. And if anything, you could change your body composition to actually hold more body fat, because it's trying really hard to slow down, damage to the body. And in the same sort of process of that, you then don't get this adaptation to your training. So we know that, when we think about training, we really all need this growth hormone spike after training in order to get that adaptation, that progression, and, optimal performance. But again, if you don't have enough energy and you're not producing hormones, that means you don't produce growth hormone as well. So that then affects your progression and your adaptation. So, people will be doing all this training, but they don't see any benefits. They don't see, they don't get the lean muscle mass gains. They don't see the speed. They don't see the kind of power that they expect to see. So you can see it kind of affects pretty much every single aspect of the body, and it is something that, potentially you could have all of those, but you might only have a couple of those. So I think one thing to highlight is, we're talking about estrogen and testosterone being low. The female body is much more sensitive to low energy availability because, female bodies are designed to reproduce. And so when the environment is not sustainable for that, it will kind of react. And so that's why it will shut everything down. So you may see a change in your menstrual cycle. So initially it might be that you see just a change, as in your periods might get lighter, they may get longer, they may get shorter. And all of that could be an indicator that there's not enough energy in the system, but eventually they'll stop. And that's a definite sign that something is wrong. So, it's not okay to not have a period. It's kind of like the thing I've been saying quite a lot over the last few years, but it's not okay to not have a period, even as an athlete. With guys, as we said, it does happen, but the body's not as sensitive. So they tend to get away with it for a lot longer. But one of the things they will see is this decline in testosterone, which then affects their morning erectile function. So when that drops to less than 5 a week, that could be an indicator that testosterone has dropped quite significantly low. And that's why, they're not having the morning erectile function.
Wow. So just listening to what you were saying there and the range of symptoms, I'm just wondering at what point we should be worried about ourselves or a friend, or because theoretically, from what you said, you could just be someone who catches a lot of infections, who has a bit of low mood and has some new digestive problems, and that could be an indication of RED-S. Should you be worried and seeking help at that point, or do you wait until something's happening to your menstrual cycle to indicate that there is more going on?
Yeah, really good question. And I think, initially, when RED-S first came out back in 2014, I would have said, you should probably, actually your menstrual cycle is the indicator. But having now worked in it for the last eight years, it's become clear to me that not everybody who's affected by RED-S actually loses their menstrual cycle. So majority of women will, but not everybody will. And so I'd say that actually, as a runner, somebody who's physically active, there are other things you can probably pick up on that may suggest that you're not okay and you probably need to go and get help. So, we talked about those sort of illness. You might also get like a lot of injuries. So again, not necessarily bone health injuries, but you might get lots of sort of tendon and ligament, soft tissue type injuries. And that could be an indicator that there's not enough energy in the system. You may start to notice that you're not recovering very well between training sessions. So, you're noticing a much more likelihood of muscle soreness, even though you've been doing the same training for ages. So that could be an indicator that something's not quite right. So I think my advice is that when you start to notice that something's a little bit out of more the norm, you are seeing, actually, I'm getting a cold every 3 or 4 weeks. That's not normal. Or I'm not sleeping particularly well, or I'm really tired and I'm not really recovering very well. I think all of this should be addressed before it gets to the point where your menstrual cycle might stop.
Yeah, that's I suppose all these things, the earlier you address them and catch them, the easier they are to sort out as well.
Yeah, totally. And I think, in the beginning I spoke about this kind of accidental REDs versus sort of intentional REDs. And if you are somebody with accidental REDs and you present with the same symptoms generally, but if you do present and we get people who come to clinic and it's the recurrent injuries, it's like, I just keep getting injured. What is this about? Obviously, if you're injured all the time, you're not going to be consistent, which means, again, you're not going to get that progression. And with these individuals, you can provide them with the right information. You can work out their energy availability and you can say, okay, well, your numbers are not quite where they should be. So let's do X in order to make sure that we get your energy availability sufficient to meet your demands. And these individuals will go off and do that. And then actually they start to reverse the situation. When you have somebody with intentional RED, as we said, because it's a lot more psychological, it's a lot more problematic. And, you're then working with behavior change, you're working with very strong belief systems, and this can then be a lot harder. So even though they can see that their behavior is not serving them, it's still something they continue to do because it provides them with this false sense of security that that's what they need to do in order to be a better athlete. So, I think it's important to say that everybody is going to be different and the approach is going to be different. And I think, one of the things I find quite frustrating working in this field, and like a lot of people have now become aware of RED-S, and a lot of people are talking about it, and a lot of people are working in it, and lots of athletes that have had it are discussing it and trying to be mentors and supporting people, which is all great. It's really important we raise awareness, but there's a real difference. I'm sure you'll understand the real difference between understanding the fact it's actually quite a clinical condition and it needs the right and the most appropriate practitioners working in it. It's not just if you eat a bit more, it's all going to be okay. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that. It's not about hitting a number. It's not about hitting a certain number of calories a day. It's actually about understanding what energy availability is and working through that. Yeah.
Oh, the more I ask you, the more questions I have. What do you think is the biggest sort of misconception about it? Because obviously, like you say, it's being talked about a lot more. What do you find is the biggest misconception, the thing that people believe, which actually maybe isn't correct?
I think, firstly, people tend to believe that you have to lose weight to have RED-S, and that's not the case. Mm-hmm. As we've talked about the kind of compensatory behaviours the body goes into, you might not lose weight, and actually that's not an indicator. That shouldn't be the only indicator. And it's actually one of my, I suppose, again, another frustration, because often when people do present to practitioners that don't understand RED-S, because they look okay and because they're kind of they're involved in what we all see as healthy behaviors, such as exercising and eating healthily, they're often dismissed as it not being a problem. So I think that's a really big kind of issue and something we have to change if we're going to improve people's care of RED-S. And I think the other misconception is this whole idea of calories in, calories out, because I think, we've all become very sport tech aware. We all wear a watch and It tells us how many calories we've burnt, and a lot of people use food tracking apps, and they kind of put that back in, and they don't understand like why then their bodies are not kind of working for them. And the reality is it's really difficult to get an accurate number for how much energy you're utilizing, because it's not as simple as what a watch might say. You know, if you think about the human body, it's a collection of chemical reactions, right? So, and everybody's chemical reactions are going to be different and going off at different times. And we don't fully understand how much energy is being expended, because people will be slightly different. And that is going to be genetic. It's going to be lifestyle oriented. It's going to be, fat-free, mass related, but also it is very individual. And one thing that we're seeing a lot of is that females, particularly lean females, active females, often their energy expenditure is really, really underestimated, which is a big problem. So I think the issue I often have is that people think, yeah, but I'm doing my watch says I've only burnt 400 calories. So I'm putting that back in. So what's the problem? And it's like, well, it's not as simple as that. As I said right at the beginning, it's about removing the amount of energy that you're utilizing and seeing what's left over. But whatever's left over, you have to divide by your weight as in your fat-free mass weight. So that's your mass that's not body fats. That's your bones, your tissues, your muscles, your organs, all that. And again, working that out is tricky. It's not a simple thing. It's not as easy as, well, I know what that is. And so I think this is where it gets complicated, because there's a lot of information out there sort of banding around, you need 2,500 calories. Well, you might do, but you might need an awful lot more. And again, the other misconception is it's not actually just about energy availability. It's also about carbohydrate availability. So we know that, if there's not sufficient carbohydrate in the system, then this tends to have an effect. So there's a study that showed that in healthy women, so this is not people with red S, but in healthy women, if they didn't hit their carbohydrate availability, it affected the diurnal rhythm of leptin, which then affected the production of luteinizing hormone, which can then obviously have a negative effect on your menstrual cycle. So it's so complicated. It's just not as simple as people first thought. And I suppose that's my biggest frustration, is that I think people assume it's because you're just not eating enough calories. And actually it's a much bigger, wider problem. It's actually also about training load. It's about the amount of stress that's going on in your system. It's much more complicated than we first thought.
And I guess also, using that menstrual cycle as a really big red flag, there are so many women who don't have regular periods anyway, because they're maybe using a contraceptive, which is leaving them without periods, or perhaps they're in the menopause. So I guess with that, you haven't even got the menstrual cycles sort of warning flags to direct you.
100%. And this is the big problem. And again, a lot of women will be on contraception, and obviously if you're on the combined oral contraceptive pill, then you might get a withdrawal bleed every month, because that's what it's designed to do. That's not a period, and it's really important to stress that is not a period. But equally, if you're on sort of progesterone contraceptive, often a lot of women lose their periods completely. Now, that doesn't mean, again, that you've got red S, but the problem is when you're on any sort of contraception, it disguises that you might have. And that is a big problem. And I'm not sitting here saying you should not think about contraception, because of course you should, but it is a problem in terms of the fact that it will disguise it. And I think, what we're seeing in our clinic is that lots of athletes have gone on the pill, understandably, for contraception, but also to kind of help regulate their menstruation so they can know what they're doing in competition. They're not having to worry about it during races and everything else. But then they get to a point in their lives where they might want to have a baby, or they just want to come off contraception, and they're not having periods. And we don't know when that changed, because they've been on this, for such a long time. And, one thing I want to highlight here is that still at the moment, a lot of women who have got amenorrhea are being put back on the pill to reboot their system. But if you think about what the contraceptive pill is, it is contraception. So it's actually going to downregulate your hormones. So why would it reboot your system? You know, and I think, again, I'll talk to a lot of practitioners and they'll say, yeah, but the estrogen's really protective for your bone health. But again, we know, Kate Ackerman has done some amazing studies that have shown that actually using the contraceptive pill in women who are in low energy availability to protect their bone health is contraindicative, because the synthetic estrogen is actually more harmful for bone health than positive. So, the actual guidelines now by the IOC and by the Endocrine Society state very, very clearly that if you have a female who has got hypothalamic amenorrhea, has been affected, and their bone health is severely affected, and it's going to take a bit of time to restore energy availability and get their menstruation back on track, then they should be put on hormone replacement therapy and ideally transdermal hormone replacement therapy to support their bone health while they're in recovery.
Yeah, really, really interesting. I think we'll just take a short break and we'll be back in a moment. Hello, I'm back speaking with Renee McGregor. We're talking about relative energy deficiency in sport. So I'm kind of wanting to move on a little bit to talk about the treatment, because as you said earlier, it's not just a case of eating more. How do you, when you've got clients with you in your clinic, how do you even begin to start planning? Where do you start with treatment?
It's a good question. I mean, so firstly, as we said, RED-S has to be diagnosed. It's a diagnosis by exclusion. So majority of females that present to our clinic, I'll be honest, majority will present because they've lost their period. So, they have amenorrhea, but we have to exclude other causes. So, the first thing we would do is a full battery of blood tests to basically work out what is going on. And if we see this sort of down-regulation of reproductive hormones, if we see a down-regulation of thyroid function, we will try and look at T3, and that gives us a good indicator of energy availability. We know that this individual, it is actually down to functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, and that it is related to this low energy availability. So that's a big part of it, like this full kind of clinical assessment. We'll also do a full nutritional and training assessment. So looking at what somebody's consuming and then amount of training they're doing, including like how much walking they might be doing, how much, just general movement they're doing as well. So it's a full battery of assessment to really identify what is going on. And then based on the information we've collected there, and we will also look at kind of the relationship somebody has with food and exercise, like looking at that sort of behavioral aspect. Is this person consciously restricting, or is it just they just don't realize? And we'll look at all of these things, and then that will help to inform us about what we do for support. So for some people, it may be necessary to completely stop training, depending on what we see in the blood tests and the assessments. But in most cases, it's actually about modifying training and also ensuring sufficient energy, sufficient carbohydrate availability, and looking at kind of that sort of change to start with. So that was kind of like our first step, will be around the modification of training and looking at timing, like nutrient timing and amounts of nutrients around training specifically. We're often like monitoring women then for quite a while, and we'll redo blood tests probably 3 months later to kind of identify, has this intervention worked? Has there been any change? And obviously, if it's all moving in the right direction, then we know we've kind of got it right. Like I said, it's very, very difficult to know exactly what energy expenditure is and how much people are actually taking in. So it is something that we monitor quite closely. And sometimes it's actually also, it's really important to stress, sometimes there does need to be a change in body composition as well. So, often we're influenced by the body ideals that are put out there. And I think sometimes people go to great lengths to try and achieve a body ideal that they think is going to be supportive of their training and of their outcome. But that body ideal might not be reality for that person. And, you know, that takes quite a lot of kind of coaching and behavioral therapy in terms of helping them to get to a point where they realize that for their genetics, for their body type, there might need to be a shift in body composition as well. So there's quite, like I said, there's quite a lot involved, but it is, you know, we do a full assessment to start with, just to kind of identify where we start and then how we proceed.
Can I just pick up on one thing you mentioned there? You mentioned about the timing of the food. How important is that, if, you know, compared to the kind of overall consumption over 24 hours? How important is it as to when you have those calories in terms of when you do your exercise?
Really important. And particularly when somebody has been diagnosed with RED-S, then, for example, fasted training has to go out the window. So there should be no fasted training whatsoever, because we know that, you know, fasted training means that the body's already stressed. If someone's got RED-S, the body is already stressed. But on top of that, if you then do a workout, you stress that body even further, particularly if there's no fuel in the system. So timing of nutrition is really, really critical. So making sure that they're taking on some sort of carbohydrate prior to their training. Now, that doesn't have to be like a massive meal. It could be that it's, you know, it could be that you take a gel. It could be that you have a banana. It could be that you have a glass of juice. And everybody's going to be different depending on what their starting point is. But you must have some carbohydrate availability pre-training, and then it's really important in that recovery phase as well. So really critical that you kind of have that recovery within the sort of 30-minute window, and that needs to be a combination of both carbs and protein, but the carbs again is really, really important. So, you know, if that can be a main meal, amazing, but if it can't, then we have to provide advice and practical solutions for, well, you know, what could that be? And it might be that it's a recovery drink followed by a meal within an hour. So overall energy intake throughout the 24 hours is really important, but the distribution of energy and the timing is also really, really key.
Okay, that's a really good and important point, I think. And, you know, and on a more positive note, well, hopefully a more positive note, do most people make a full recovery from this, or is this something that they constantly have to be aware of and manage?
I think, yes, most people do make a recovery. And I think particularly those that are in accidental RED-S, they make a full recovery without any concerns. I think when it's more associated with dysfunctional eating and those eating behaviors and much more of a sort of a psychological cause for it, you have to work through so many different aspects as well. So, you know, like we know that all human behavior has a purpose. So if somebody is consciously restricting their energy intake, it's trying to kind of work out, well, what is the purpose of that? And that could be a number of things. Again, we know that humans, you know, they do not like emotional risk. They like to avoid emotional risks. Humans do not like to feel uncomfortable. And if we are in a competitive environment where we have low self-esteem and we have this constant sense of unworthiness, and, you know, the narrative in our head is you're not good enough, you need to push harder, then we have to work with that. And I think you can get absolute full recovery, but you have to be committed to becoming self-aware. So it's not about changing the person, but it's about getting them to become aware of their personality type and helping them to learn to manage the very high standards they place in themselves in order to be more balanced, I guess, and then be able to be more rational about their approach. So it's a bit more complicated. You do get recovery, but it will take a lot longer.
And if I'm just thinking people listening to this, you know, maybe starting to wonder about their own energy availability, and perhaps if they've just got a few mild symptoms and they, as I say, they're not too worried about it, but they're just noticing some things. Is it enough for them to just cut back a little bit on the training and just eat a little bit more and see how things pan out? Because my worry is knowing where and how to get help.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Juliet. You know, this is something especially if we're catching it. And also this is why it's so great to have opportunities like this to talk about it, so that you can help people to catch it quickly, then yes, absolutely pulling back on your training, increasing your intake, focusing a little bit more on carbohydrate. Like there's definitely been over the years, there's definitely been this kind of movement to not include carbohydrate. And that is often the biggest cause of why people end up in this low energy availability and this red S state. So, there's definitely things you can do on your own, like getting help. I appreciate is actually quite hard, and working with the right types of people can also be complicated. But there's also a lot of information out there now, like there is a website that has been endorsed by BASES, which is the British Association for Sports Medicine and Sports Science. And that's been written by Nikki Kay, myself, and a few others, and it does talk you through what Red S is. It talks you through what tests you might need to do. It gives you information on how to support yourself. Like there is good information out there. Obviously, you brought up the Train Brave campaign, but there's also the Train Brave podcast where it's become very Red S focused. So again, I know a lot of people have really benefited from listening to that. So there's much more available resource out there. But absolutely, if you're kind of listening to what we're talking about today and feeling like you resonate, then definitely give it a go. I think that the thing to sort of add is, if you find it difficult to cut down on your training and increase your intake, then that might be an indicator that you definitely do need to try and get some support.
What was the website you were mentioning?
It's called Health. Yeah, so it's Health number 4 Performance.
Health 4 Performance, brilliant. Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes as well. Yeah, that's good. And if GP presumably is your first port of call if you're listening in the UK, obviously this goes globally. So, do people, from your point of view, generally get understood and listened to, or do they have to sometimes be real advocates for getting the help they need? So this is something that I am really championing at the moment. I'm really pushing to be able to provide more training for GPs in this particular area, because you're right, GP is going to be the first port of call. And again, unfortunately, they haven't been trained on this. It's a fairly new phenomenon. And I think, you have 10 minutes, so it's very difficult to get all the information you need in those 10 minutes. And so I'm very aware that GPs need support in this. So I'd say some are great, as in with all the cases, and some may need a little bit more support. But what I'd always say is, if you suspect you have Red S, go armed. Go with the Health for Performance website. Go with information that you can talk to your GP openly about it. Because the one thing I know is that often GPs are very open to listening and learning. And I've worked with a number of GPs, even within our clinic, where we've sent somebody back saying this person has Red S, this is what it is. And we've had lovely letters back saying, thank you for helping us understand this. This has been really helpful for our ongoing support for other people. So I think, I think sometimes you might not get the answers you want, but I always say this with anything is, if you know there's a problem, please don't take no for an answer. Keep going back. Try a different GP if you need to. Take the information with you and keep pushing. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. I would second what you're saying. In my time as a GP, I was always more than happy when somebody came with information, because you can't be an expert on everything. And to have someone come and say, I think this is what I've got, and provide the information, you can then help them to get further specialist intervention if they need it. So that's brilliant. I just wanted to touch quickly on, before we finish up, on one of your books, which is called Orthorexia. When healthy eating goes bad, that's the subtitle, isn't it? But I know a lot of people won't know what orthorexia is, and I think it's quite important. Can you just explain? Yeah, of course. So orthorexia is, if you basically look at the definition, it is the obsession with eating purely. So it's that obsession. I think it sort of came about because there was this whole hashtag eat clean. Hashtag clean eating. And it's kind of where it came about, that people started to become very, very fixated on eating in a certain way to promote health. But as with anything, if it becomes compulsive and obsessive, it then starts to create anxiety if you deviate from these rules. So where it's not about saying you can't eat healthily. It's not about saying that at all. But it's when your food rules or your behaviors around food become so fixed
that you can't deviate. Like, you know, you can never have a piece of cake. You can never go out with your friends. You can never have alcohol. Like, you know, we all know that moderation is the key when it comes to our diets, but these individuals can't do moderation. They are so focused on getting it right, even though they're not getting it right. And I think what happens is it becomes this very obsessive way of eating. And how it differs from, say, anorexia and other eating disorders is that it's not really a focus on body image as such. It's very much a focus on health. So often individuals may go down this path because there's been a health scare, and that then has contributed to this kind of belief system that I need to eat in a certain way to make sure that I'm pure and I'm safe. You know, again, it sort of sets up that false sense of security that we talked about earlier. Similarly, we do see a lot in athletes and those people that are very physically active, because it's almost like a way of disguising, you know, I'm an athlete, so I need to eat in this certain way. But again, we know that even with professional athletes and elite level athletes, they may have certain times in their calendar where they do have to be quite strict and follow certain eating patterns. But they also have downtime where they can go away and, you know, enjoy the foods that have been off limits for a period of time. So that's what orthorexia is this very, you know, this obsession with eating purely.
Thank you. I think we all feel educated, and I can see how that's a growing problem, especially perhaps with social media and food trends and like the hashtags that you mentioned. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. Right. Well, I honestly could talk for another hour, but I think we better wrap it up there. I'm really grateful. I've definitely learned a lot, and I know that people listening will have learned a lot as well. We will put all the links in the show notes so that people know where to go to get more information.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. And again, like I said, it's so great to have a podcast that is talking about important topics and raising awareness. And, you know, hopefully someone's resonated with that today and they can go and get the support they need or change their behavior to support themselves.
Thank you very much, Renee. That's fantastic. Thank you for joining me for Season 2, Episode 4 of the Active Health Podcast. Just a reminder, you can download this show on your usual podcast apps. And please leave me a little review. It really helps to spread the word and help people to find out and get information about these important topics. If you want to find Renee, her website is reneemcgregor.com. And I do recommend having a look at her Instagram as well, at Renee McGregor. It's really fantastic, and I definitely learn a lot from there. You can find me at drjulietmcgrattan.com, and don't forget to follow our hosts at Wisp Sports on social media and their website wispsports.com. That is all for now. Join me again for the next episode of Active Health.